What you want to know is whether this message will shift somebody's vote, not whether they think it's a good message.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you are joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Adam Schaeffer is founder and chief behavioral scientist of Evolving Strategies, a behavioral science and data analytics firm using experiments in artificial intelligence to modify voter behavior. He has a PhD from the University of Virginia and has done stints at AEI and Cato. In our conversation, we learn more about what the left is doing with behavioral science, what Republicans can do to catch up, and how new tech can help make political advertising more effective. Adam, obviously the left has a friendlier relationship with academia, and this has led to a more robust ecosystem for research on their side. Give us a sense of what that looks like. What are the organizations involved, and what kind of advantages is that giving them?
I think just the very fact that they have a supply of people that are trained in a particular skill set and a particular way at looking at politics and trying to understand what works and what doesn't, specifically, coming from political science, political behavior, that supply kind of creates its own demand to some extent, I think. That said, it's been a long time in development on the left. Going way back to the early 2000s with a number of the unions, AFL-CIO, picking up on some of the turnout literature, field experiments on how to increase turnout among voters, which led to social pressure campaigns that listeners might be familiar with, that essentially let people know their voting record is public. Who they vote for is not public, but whether or not they voted is public. And there's some early tests of that approach, kind of saying, we're going to check up on your voter record and let you know and let your neighbors know whether you voted. The first experiment in particular created a lot of outrage. It was a very aggressive approach.
Yeah, but it works.
It worked. It worked. And it's been toned down a little bit. They try to make it a little less creepy, still creepy, but the unions, my understanding, kind of picked up that, the big part of what they do was turning out membership, and got into the turnout experiments, got into trying to optimize that. And toward, the mid 2000s, they were looking at kind of more expansively at Persuasion. The Analyst Institute was an organization that developed fairly early on, toward the later half of the first decade of the 2000s, and that to me, I'm not embedded in that world, so it's kind of looking from the outside in. But that was really kind of a central node for testing and disseminating best practices, and really starting to lean into message testing in particular, separate from turnout, which is a little bit more difficult to do, just because you don't have a voter record, that hard outcome.
Right. You
have to ask people, do survey experiments, maybe follow up in the field with surveys. And kind of that initial development, and the fact that there are a lot of liberal professors, Democrats in academia who had that skill set, just set up kind of a reinforcing cycle of influence, from academics and politics, that I think allowed it to spread, even where there's still a lot of resistance, because the politics has a long-standing ecosystem of practitioners, pollsters, messaging people, campaign people that do things a certain way and are pretty resistant to change, like everyone. And so even on the left, it was difficult and not linear in terms of really expanding this testing approach, this randomized controlled trial approach to optimizing your campaign.
And we're going to dig into that in just a minute, but I think I want to call out something that you referenced here, which is the role of the labor unions. and that the left have this sort of always on infrastructure that needs to be doing turnout and testing. It's not like on the Republican side where we scale up and scale down for elections. And so I think that for our listeners to understand is a crucial component about the cultural advantage that Democrats have when it comes to sort of the behavioral science behind politics. So, Adam, where do our traditional methods of message testing like focus groups, polling, and dial testing fall short when it comes to making sure that a campaign's ads are effective?
Yeah, I mean, all the traditional approaches kind of fail on the same front, which is they ask people what they think will work with them or other people. And human beings just simply don't have that kind of ability to introspect. When you ask somebody what is persuasive, it becomes a cognitive task, something that they're explicitly thinking about and analyzing, rather than something that they're reacting to that they were exposed to, right? So it'd be like giving somebody a pill that is supposed to help with heart disease or blood pressure and say, do you think this is going to work? Based on the taste or the color or the size of the shape. It's kind of one of the most fundamental, findings in psychology is that people are pretty bad at introspection and they're really bad at self-prediction. You ask somebody, are they going to really get serious about exercising next week? Yes, I'm determined to. And next week rolls around and, they haven't gone to the gym yet. And so there's a big gap between what will work and what people think will work on themselves, even for them personally. It's very, very difficult for people to do that. Also, things like how much do you agree with this statement, or do you like this statement better than that statement, this one more persuasive than another one? You have a real problem there, even if you didn't have the problem of introspection. You don't know who is actually persuadable. Right. So something could be rated very highly in terms of persuasiveness. Somebody might say, 70% of people might say this particular message is very persuasive. But, and one might be 50%, but that one that is supposedly less persuasive might actually be persuasive with people who are persuadable. Right. Most people are going to vote one way or the other, regardless. And they might find something persuasive, but it won't actually make them switch their vote. So you have that problem as well. How do you decompose that? And the only way you can do that is to randomly assign people to a control or a treatment group, and then compare the outcomes in one to the other, just like you would with a clinical drug trial on, blood pressure medication. See what the outcome is in terms of did it actually lower blood pressure compared to the placebo?
And I think there are even some more basic challenges than that, which is, I've worked on campaigns before where we got polling back and it said, this message is a winner, right? Let's say it's an 80% message and you guys would be silly not to use it. And then you take that finding, then you have to turn it into a 30-second ad script, then you have to turn it into visuals, and between the poll and the ad going out on TV, it wasn't as persuasive as we thought. And so that's another kind of classic example of, these tools are really important, but they don't tell you the full picture. We would have been better served by testing that ad before putting it out on the air. Right.
And one of the additional complications is things that are familiar and that people like, they will tell you are effective, right? So if something is shocking or disturbing or makes somebody uncomfortable, they're unlikely to say that they like it.
Right.
And an opinion change in persuasion is an inherently uncomfortable process, right? If you're leaning toward one candidate, it's uncomfortable if you hear something bad about that candidate. Now that might push you toward, the other candidate. It might push you toward changing your opinion on it. But people like certainty. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like to have their preferences or perspectives challenged. So, oftentimes we find actually things that are a bit more aggressive or are likely to make people uncomfortable, especially new pieces of information, are the things that are most likely to change somebody's opinion, because it's not already part of their considerations, right? That's a big thing too. If
you have to factor in, how does it fit with my preconceived priors?
How it fits with your priors, but also just is it new? If you're telling somebody something that they already know, that is already something that they know about a candidate or a party, that's really unlikely to change anyone's opinion. It's already part of the considerations that they have, and they built that into their decision at that point. So introducing something new is going to be the most likely way to shift them. Sometimes you can increase the weight or the salience of a consideration they already have. But again, it's already part of their decision-making process. It's already something they considered.
So explain the randomized control trials, RCTs. How does that work in a messaging context where, it's not like the blood pressure medicine where you give a placebo and then the new drug and I can measure the blood pressure. So how do we translate that methodology into politics?
Sure. It's not a direct translation of a medical trial, because you have a hard outcome in each individual that you can measure from time A to time B. In pretty fundamental respects, it is the same. In other words, we bring people into, typically what we do is an online survey environment. You bring in respondents. They answer some preliminary kind of control variables, party ID, past vote history, that kind of thing. And then they're randomly assigned to either a control group where they get the equivalent of a placebo. It's a non-political text or video. And other people are randomly assigned into a treatment, the actual message. And after that, we ask them, have you seen something like this before? We don't want them thinking that we're trying to persuade them. So we present it as, have you seen something like this before? After that, we typically will measure, support for Republican versus Democrat or a policy. And then we have other questions that we ask. But at that point, you have the control group and how they responded, how likely they were to vote for Republican. And you have the treatment group and what's the vote for Republican in that group. And the difference between those groups, because you've randomly assigned them, the only thing that's different is whether they received a political message or a placebo. And so we can see whether it shifted people toward the Republican or in the direction we wanted on policy. We go a step further. These survey respondents, they're known to us on the voter file. We have all their voter file information, consumer data, and so we can use that to predict for the control group and then separately for the treatment group statewide what the likelihood of any given voter is to vote for a Republican in the control group versus the treatment group, the political message group. And doing that, we can identify the most persuadable voters statewide. So we can determine overall if the message is likely to work, whether there are any subgroup impacts, and then we can come up with predictions on how likely particular voters are going to be persuadable.
So particularly astute listeners will note that as part of that process, you are paying to reach people to give them no message, essentially the placebo. Right. And so one of the big hurdles that we have to adopting a research and testing culture in politics is that we are in a time-constrained environment and we have money constraints. So at the federal level, obviously, there are hard dollar caps. So in order to do this, you've got to sort of figure out do I spend money on something that is purposely not going to work, the placebo.
Right.
And so help us explain what the cost benefit analysis is here and how listeners who like what you're saying, want to take this on, might overcome this hurdle.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing to really recognize is that a lot of messages have zero effect. So pretty much any amount of money that you spend, if you're going to otherwise be going forward with a message that has zero effect, that means all the money you spend is completely wasted.
And just to clarify, when you say zero effect, you mean on ballot preference or turnout or something like that?
Exactly. It doesn't move anyone. Yeah, it's as if you showed them a Coca-Cola ad or something like that. So, I mean, from that perspective, even if you spent everything but $100, I mean, you're still better off. Sometimes we actually find negative effects from a message. It actually backfires, and in that case, you're actually spending money to hurt your candidate or your issue or whatever it is. So I think that's really important. I think a lot of people kind of think, well, maybe we could have something more effective, but this will still be effective because it looks like a good ad. It's just simply not the case. We do typically find that, especially when we're doing the modeling, the prediction, and identifying the people who are most likely persuadable. Now you're talking about even bigger increases in efficiency that might be, even if an ad is effective, and maybe it's +1, +2 points for the population overall. And by drilling down to the people who are most likely to be persuadable, we can, boost that impact to maybe 6, 7, maybe even 10 points. So you're spending money only on the people that are really going to respond positively and just have a massively more efficient impact from the money you spend. So there really are huge efficiency gains that you can get out of this.
So the idea is you're going from, let's say, a machine gun to a rifle, right? Where you're going to fire less ammunition, but with more precision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or like a shotgun from very far away, right? Where you might wing something maybe versus being much closer. You're going to hit your target.
Right. So the trade-off then becomes, yes, you're going to divert money. And so maybe your overall ad spend goes down, but that the message is actually moving the people you need it to move.
Right. And, the cost of doing this is pretty small compared to, the budgets of most major campaigns or independent expenditure campaigns. People do polling, people do all kinds of other things that oftentimes are equivalent in pricing. They just don't get you a whole lot in return.
Well, yeah, I mean, having been in the trenches, you say that, and like just sitting here rationally, like I totally agree with you, and I don't think I'd ever be involved in another campaign that wasn't doing this level of message testing. But it really does come to, it gets tough when you're like, look, they've got 1,000 more points of TV than us this week. And so we're trained to kind of go dollar for dollar. This is a little bit of a mindset shift. And I would point out there was there are C4s and super PACs on the left that actually do this kind of testing on behalf of their candidates and other groups. So they kind of eat the costs. I think There's one group that was just doing all these kind of hand-drawn cartoon ads, right? So they were trying to very quickly iterate on creative concepts without spending much on production as a sort of template for, okay, here's how this ad should look like. We've basically storyboarded it for you, and our research is publicly available. Feel free to copy.
Yeah. There's a lot of pooling of resources and kind of on the left as well. I mean, that's a good point. It's done in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different organizations across the left. That is helpful. And I think especially for something like exploring the political landscape and kind of the issue landscape, that makes a lot of sense too. And there's not really anything like that on the right, in terms of, okay, we have all these different issues, which ones are really popping right now? And then we can disseminate that information about what seems to be working best in a more general sense, issue by issue. I think that could be really helpful to the right as well. And is something that the left certainly does.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Adam Schaeffer, a behavioral scientist. We're talking about the ways that science can be used to modify voters' behavior, whether that's turnout or persuasion. Adam, what does the development of technology look like in this space to reduce costs and time involved? So you alluded to, the costs being more bearable thanks to things like online surveys. What are some other tech that's on the horizon or already in the field?
I think just scale, and there's some things that could be automated at scale that would bring down cost. I think there's always going to be somewhat of a limit on that, simply because you're trying to get a representative sample swath of the electorate in any given context in any given election, and recruiting survey takers is difficult, and I don't think there's a ton that can be done technologically on that front. There's panels and things that you can do that you can use that can lower costs a bit. There's some limitations there, especially in terms of deployment. I think for exploratory research, for just exploring what issues are effective with which groups, it makes a lot of sense. But I think really more scale is probably where you get some cost efficiencies and pooling resources for testing and research that would be useful across a large number of organizations.
One of the areas that strikes me as sort of a fertile field, if you will, is artificial intelligence and generative AI, because I don't think we're too far away from the scenario where your voter file for an election can basically be addressed as its own little world where voters behave as artificially intelligent in this world, and you can show them ads, you can give them pieces of information. I think creating those kinds of labs is really going to be the next level, because as you say, the bottleneck and the cost hurdle for all of this is getting people's time to give us their feedback. But if we can train AI on that, then we're off to the races.
It's an interesting idea. I was talking with somebody about this the other day, and I'm not sure what the time horizon looks like on that, or what the potential is. Simply, my understanding of AI is that it's kind of reflecting back what already has been, or what already has been said, right? In kind of probabilistic. So you
really good autocomplete is the way I explain it.
Right. So one of the problems is that the political landscape is constantly changing. Political coalitions are shifting, new issues come up or they come up in new ways. New events happen that change people's perspective. And so it's really a predictive task, or right now what is happening. And I do worry about AI in that it's backward looking. So it might be giving you answers that they might be fairly accurate in terms of how somebody would respond, or a type of voter would respond to a particular message. But it's doing it based on the past 5 years of how somebody like that would respond. And I wouldn't think would be able to handle something that is forward looking, or that hasn't been seen, a new issue, a new framing of an issue, a new political landscape. And then you throw in candidates to it's a wild card, right? I mean, pre-Trump, if we had really powerful AI back then, would you be able to get anything useful about how voters would respond, and what types of voters would respond in what way to the emergence of Trump?
Right. The last 5 years or 6 years have been kind of a good counter argument to that, right? Of past performance is not indicative of future results. Obviously, changing our culture is another significant challenge. And by that, I mean the political culture. It's not fully baked in or adopted on the left, and certainly not on the right. I'm curious to hear what kind of arguments you've developed now that you've got this business and you're persuading people to address what I call the double sales challenge, which we see all the time in political tech, which is you have to convince people that this is something that you need to do, right? So the idea of message testing, randomized control trials, and then that you are the solution. So you've had some success doing that. What are the arguments or explanations that you've practiced over the years?
Yeah, it's funny. I'd love to say that we've tested different messages, but
you have by getting people to say yes or no.
Yeah, iterative. But I feel like we're always trying to adjust and trying to tweak it, or trying to find newer, better ways to explain it and persuade people, like you're saying. Unfortunately, we're going after a very particular type of person in a particular industry. So we can't really scale it to the extent we can find the perfect message. One thing we do focus on is the efficiency aspect. We do often lean on, look, the left is doing this. That sometimes is a big factor. Political operatives or people involved in politics will be like, oh, they've found some secret, and sometimes that's more persuasive than anything. Is just to say they're doing it, they're successful with it. The efficiency argument, trying to explain, what we talked about earlier, that if what you want to know is whether this message will shift somebody's vote, not whether they think it's a good message. And the traditional ways of testing messages is essentially just asking whether they like it. And that's a very different thing. So those are kind of the primary ways we go about trying to persuade people. Sometimes people get it immediately, and really, it's almost as if they were looking for this, but just didn't know what it was until you explain what it is, and they are immediately on board with it. A lot of times it takes repeat exposure to it, and it kind of sinks in. It's not a super complicated concept. Randomized controlled trials or experiments, they've been around for a long time. People have kind of a general sense of how they work in the medical field, but people are kind of enveloped or grow up in an environment where they think if you ask somebody something, you will get a response back that is a true reflection of what that person is thinking or feeling or will work. One of the things we bring up a lot of times is in focus groups, a lot of times people have the experience, they'll show a negative ad, and the focus group will hate it. They'll say, we don't like negative ads. It's too negative. This isn't going to work. I really don't like it. But they know, from experience, this seems to really work. If you have a good negative ad that hits somebody on a vulnerability, you can see, opinion shift in the electorate.
It's really impolite to say, hey, do you like seeing someone get poked in the eye? And answer, yes,
right. And these people are all being honest, I think, usually in the focus groups. They really don't like it. That doesn't mean it's not effective.
Yeah. And
a lot of times when we bring that up, just because a lot of people have had experience with that, the disconnect between what voters say they like or in a focus group and the effectiveness that they can see in a lot of negative ads, that sometimes kind of like brings the light bulb on.
Yeah, and by the way, this whole field of behavioral science and where the core concept, cognitive biases, are right. New. They're not fully baked in to sort of certainly our professional mental models and our political mental models. So again, it underscores how rapidly not just politics, but business and technology and everything is evolving based on these new discoveries. So it's still a new field of practice. And one of the things that strikes me is it reminds me a lot of, go back 10 years ago now, when people were talking about, well, we can model your entire voter file based on a few data points, if we do a survey. That was new. That took a lot of convincing. Now it is the standard playbook for every campaign. Now you look at smart TV buying, right, where you then take that modeled file and you put it on really complicated audience and consumption data. That's what this kind of reminds me of. Is we're going to look back in 2 or 4 years and say, hey, this was a smart thing to do all along. I can't believe we weren't doing it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people, I get it. People get used to doing things a certain way. It's comfortable. It's not easy for anyone to change, or to disrupt kind of the standard practice. It's a lot of times kind of a big ask, especially for campaigns. I mean, we tend to work with independent expenditure organizations, PACs, C3, C4s, because one advantage there is that the organization continues through election cycles, right? And there's a continuity in personnel. They typically have a focused mission that they really want to accomplish. Whereas in a campaign, these come together for a relatively brief amount of time. Most of them are predetermined. The candidate's going to win or lose regardless of what anyone does. I mean, you could do a horrible job in the campaign and you're still going to win or lose. It was just baked in because of the the state or the district. And then there's lots of power centers and kind of inherent conflict in terms of what people want to get out of it in the campaign. So we do find that it's much easier to sell an organization rather than a campaign. And in addition to what you were saying before, campaigns are extraordinarily resource constrained. They're trying to ramp up funding from zero, unless you're a huge, favored incumbent, in which case you probably don't need to do a whole lot anyway.
So for someone who's listening and they're like interested in learning more about this, and maybe dipping their toe in the water, what are some steps that they need to be doing, whether that's getting prepared to incorporate in their budget or some things that they can study? How does someone start adopting this testing mindset and give us some I guess, first 5 steps before, signing up with a firm like yours and doing the RCTs?
They could read stuff that I've written or that we have on our website. David Shore, he's a progressive Democrat political operative who is deeply involved in the testing world there. He has given a lot of interviews and written a lot and tweets a lot about all this, including a lot of the research out of political science and academia, which is where most of it is public. They're not publishing a whole lot of this stuff from internal Democratic tests. But just, kind of poke around on it. If they're really interested in it, there's a lot of interesting political science work out there. All based with randomized controlled trials on messaging and turnout. Sasha Eisenberg,
yeah,
wrote a book. It's a little dated now, but he wrote a book a while back about randomized controlled trials and kind of the political science behind it and the practical politics.
That's the Victory Lab for anyone who.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff out there, just, Googling around and to kind of get a sense of what's been done, what's been found, and get a little deeper on how it works.
Well, my thanks to Adam for a great conversation today. You can learn more about him in our show notes. There's a link to several of his articles. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all that we ask you to do is share it with a friend or colleague, and you look smarter in the process as well. So it's a win-win for everybody. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also sign up for email updates on our website at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, I'll say goodbye. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.